A few more filtering in as we go. We have, as you know, had a few weeks of break, interruption, disruption. Hopefully we can pick up this thread before we left off. I should tell you at the outset, in case I forget, that we're going to have one more little interruption next Sunday because of the congregational meeting. So that means we have a total of 2 Sundays left to cover about 8 weeks worth of material. Discussion as it takes place historically between two rather extreme statements on the whole issue of the nature of humanity. This is centering primarily in the 6th chapter of the Westminster, and most of the material we're covering covers around paragraph 2 of chapter 6. But I'd like to this morning, since this is the next to the last session we're going to have on it before the summer, I'd like to read the entire paragraph, or the entire chapter, because it all hangs together pretty well. And that's, even though I would like to do a more in-depth treatment of each of these paragraphs, that won't be possible. Then on our final and concluding session, which will be 2 weeks from today, we'll do basically the same thing on chapter 7, which treats the question of covenant. So we're going to be doing more of a survey format than really an in-depth treatment of any of this, except that I do want to finish out the material we were working through in some depth on the question of the historical understanding of the fall. And we're going to be looking this morning back to the Reformation, which is really the position set forth in the Westminster, an attempt to understand how in the context of the debate that particular understanding was set forth. And hopefully you'll be able to remember the material we covered and sort of get the context in mind then as we focus on the Reformed understanding of this. So before we get underway, then let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, again, we acknowledge the hand of your grace and your mercy to bring us together here, to provide to us the opportunity to understand, to review, to be enlightened and encouraged through the vehicle of the Westminster Confession, but behind that, through the scriptures themselves and the revelation that you've made to us in Christ and in your word. We pray that our treatment this morning would be fair and honest and balanced and truthful, that we would be Christian people of integrity as we take up the issues that are most important in all of life, and cause our time together to be richly rewarded as we render it to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, we're in chapter 6. So we've been spending some time here in chapter 6, and most of our discussion has been an expansion of paragraph 2, but let's start in paragraph 1. There was an act of disobedience. Our first parents, being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan, sin. This their sin God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit. So again, the Westminster ties this back to the providence of God. This was not a mistake, a goof, blunder. God didn't raise his hands and say, oh my goodness, my God. Now this was unexpected, and see an intrusion of some completely uncalculated happenstance, but this was in fact within the providence of God, ordained for his purposes. And that, of course, takes us back to the whole mystery of that issue that we looked at earlier. The other thing that I want you to note here is that the act of sin itself poses something of a mystery, and this is a discussion that we bypassed completely. But I want to at least call your attention to the fact that it's there. Now, as part of the broader Christian theological question of the problem of evil, which we've sort of hit at from time to time, but never addressed squarely. And what I just want to say at this point is that is a lively mystery. But anytime we try to skirt it or treat it lightly as if it weren't a problem, then we're being a little dishonest, really. There are answers we provide, but I think it's safe to say that probably in the history of theology, there's never been a thoroughly satisfying answer. The Westminster doesn't attempt to give us a satisfying answer. A recognition of the difficulty is always there. The problem as we confront it here is this. How can we have two people who are created with righteousness and true holiness, as we read in chapter 4? They are in an ideal situation. They are there by the immediate handiwork of God. We take the biblical account. They are there without any fault, in the image of God. How can these people, who we would expect have an inclination toward obedience and an untarnished capacity to capture and reflect God's holiness and dignity and so on, how can these people then have been susceptible to the enticement to sin? Now, if we understand the nature of sin, and if we understand what it is within us that moves us to sin, then there is a problem there. That is a very difficult problem. I don't have an answer to it. I don't know that we have a satisfying answer, but a lot of attempts. And I can stand there this morning and recite about 20 different theories, philosophical theories and theological attempts to get at it, which have been very helpful, they've helped to eliminate some possibilities. But as far as really answering that question, it just remains as a kind of a mystery that is still insoluble. I'd like to allow more of that so that we more fully appreciate the nature of the minute mystery, but I feel like at least that much should be said. This paragraph was an attempt to resolve it, but simply to state it. Now, the next paragraph begins to treat the consequences. What happened? Something changed according to the Scriptures and according to the Westminster. Because of this sin, there was an effect, and the effect is the beginning of the description that is in paragraph 2. By this sin, they fell. They fell from their original righteousness and communion with God, and so became dead in sin, which is the biblical language. They had become sick, weak. You see, they didn't sort of approximate kind of disaster. It wasn't. Rather, it was a total disaster. And there was the result of a complete collapse. So they became dead, which is more of an absolute category rather than as gravely ill, which means they might have still, recovered under their own speed. So they became dead in sin and wholly defiled. And again, this is Reformation language. Not partly defiled, not mostly defiled, not almost totally defiled, you see, but wholly defiled, which reflects the total depravity doctrine we'll look at in a minute. And wholly defiled in all the faculties and parts of soul and body. So, the next statement that is made is, of course, the one we've been looking at in some depth. Just how extensive was the effect? Was it, as Pelagius would maintain, little tumble that they quickly recovered and there was no great distresses or consequence and that we have inherited nothing? Or is it, as Augustine maintained, a terrible and horrible disaster, really, complete and total collapse? I mean, each one of us was wholly affected. Well, as you can see, the Westminster sides much more forcefully with the Augustinian understanding than with the Pelagian. The next statement in paragraph 3 talks about what happened in the ensuing generations. The posterity of Adam and Eve were also affected. So we have in paragraph 3, they being the root of our mankind, the guilt of this sin was imputed, and the same death in sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity, descending from them by ordinary generation. So we see that it wasn't just these two individuals in the garden, but that there is a continuing impact that the rest of us inherit. It's twofold. The first term that's used is guilt, which is a theoretical term. It's describing our situation, as it were, before the tribunal of God. We are guilty, as if we had committed the same crime. Now that's an issue that we will address really briefly in 2 weeks, and it's this whole question. Why am I held accountable for something I didn't do? If you haven't heard that protest or thought it yourself, then it should spring to your mind at this moment as an obvious question. I wasn't there at the garden. I didn't eat the apple. I wasn't the one, you see, that committed that crime. And after all I know, if I'd been there, I might not have. And there's sort of a protest that naturally arises here that, you know, if I wasn't the one that committed that crime, then how come I am as guilty as if I had? This is a given guilt. People are born with, they come into this world as infants with this guilt already above them, the judgment already against them, not born innocent, born guilty. Now, we've talked about fairness before in this class, and we've looked at it at different angles, but again, I think the protest that comes is, and I'm sound very fair. I mean, our judicial system, at least as we're familiar with it, doesn't hold people accountable for crimes they didn't commit. And yet here is exactly what seems to be, well, is being stated by the Westminster, and the Westminster would say is being stated by the Scripture, particularly Romans chapter 5. Well, if that's a problem, we'll look at it. We'll give it much shorter treatment than it deserves, but that is there. The second component in paragraph 3, there's not only guilt, but additionally, there is this same death. So the death in sin that came as a consequence to Adam and Eve also passes on. And we are, in a sense, born dead. We are spiritually stillborn, you see. We're born dead, and we're born additionally with this corrupted nature. And again, that poses an issue. How does that happen? So now we're in paragraph 4. Notice the change in the personal pronoun. Now, for the first 3 paragraphs was third person plural, they, them, their. But in paragraph 4 now it becomes first person plural. From this original corruption whereby we were utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil. So the Westminster Court takes the classic understanding of this point. And the reason we say is because we have a disposition in our hearts, and the technical phrase is the original corruption you see there, or as it's more commonly called, original sin. That is, there is something inside us at the levels of our inner person that becomes the origins of sin. Original sin is not a reference to the sin of Adam and Eve, which is a popular misconception. That's not the original sin. Original sin is a theological term that describes a state or a condition within us, sometimes called sinful nature or something like that, but it is the condition of having a corrupted nature, and the point here is that it's out of that nature or out of that corruption that actual sins, that is, sins we enact, we do, in thought, word, deed, and so on, that those actual sins are expressions of the condition of original sin. We're born with original sin. Original sin renders us guilty, but it also becomes the wellspring of continued actions of sin. So this is what's being set forth in paragraph 4. Paragraph 5 treats a question that we will look at, and we'll do this next year. Next year we'll spend a lot of time on soteriology. And in soteriology we'll be looking at what is the nature of the regenerating person. Does regeneration eradicate original sin, for example? You recall the Roman Catholic view that we looked at the last time we met was that infant baptism effected a regeneration that removes original sin and leaves only concupiscence. Remember that? The paragraph 5 treats that issue. The corruption of nature during this life does remain in those that are regenerated. And although it be through Christ pardoned, see, that's how it deals with guilt, and mortify, which is treating that issue of the original sin itself. Yet, both itself and all the motions thereof are truly and properly sin. So the Westminster's understanding here is that even after regeneration, the effect of original sin remains. We still have a nature that inclines towards sin, and it is now doing battle with another nature, which is there by virtue of the Spirit's work. And thus we have a conflict, and the conflict, you'll recall, is treated by Paul, for example, in Romans 7, in the book of Galatians, and mentioned elsewhere. This flesh against the Spirit conflict is really at least being alluded to here, and is developed quite a bit more extensively later. And finally, in paragraph 6, every sin, both original and actual, there's the distinction. being a transgression of the righteous law of God, and contrary thereunto, does in its own nature bring guilt upon the sinner, whereby he is bound over to the wrath of God and the curse of the law, and so may subject to death with our miseries of spiritual, temporal, and eternal. I'm simply a way of saying this is serious business. It should not be taken lightly, and probably that the hidden point here that needs to be especially mentioned is, notice that it says every sin, both original and actual. That is, original sin, which is not a sin of action, it's a sin of being. Even original sin gives rise to guilt, being bound over to the wrath of God, the curse of the law, being subject to death. This is again where the fairness problem, I think, arises. No, I didn't do anything. I didn't say, well, I'd like to be born sinful, please. I didn't make any kind of decision like that. I didn't have any control over the condition into which I was thrust into existence. I just showed up one day. There I was, and then I was born with this condition of original sin. It was there. Nothing I did. I mean, I didn't, commit some sin immediately upon birth, and therefore I became guilty. I was born guilty. I was born guilty. David's statement in Psalm 51, in sin did my mother conceive me. Just beginning of existence at the earliest moment. Even then, you see, the element of sin being present is very difficult for us to really accept. And it is really the point here in paragraph 6 that even that original sin renders us guilty enough to deserve the wrath of God. Again, that seems awfully harsh. And so that kind of touches the issue that we mentioned a few moments ago. Well, look, again, I don't know that we'll satisfy the inquiries at that point, but we sort of just know how that has been worked out. And I think the answers at this point are somewhat satisfying. I feel like they're more satisfying, at least, than the original issue I was raising about. Why would they sin in the first place? That one, I think, is difficult. This one is difficult, but I think it can be resolved at least to some satisfaction. So that's, in a nutshell, then, paragraph 6. I want to come back and remind you that Pelagius did his work, as did Augustine. We sort of characterize this like a ping-pong match, where Pelagius basically taking sin with very little seriousness. Augustine returned it with the early doctrine of total depravity, shot through with said, affected body and soul of parts, faculties thereof. The answer that came during the Middle Ages was a compromise then that we reviewed, which is called semi-Pelagianism, which takes from Augustine the view that we need grace to be saved. We can't save ourselves, as virtually Pelagius maintained. But we can, without grace, make a start towards salvation. So there's the compromise. We've got to have grace to be saved because we are fallen, but we can at least make a start. There is at least part of us which is capable of moving toward God, even without grace. And thus, God's grace toward us is conditioned on the fact that we first made a move toward Him. Well, the semi-Pelagians surfaced all back, and the response then was during the Reformation, particularly from Luther and Calvin, and they responded by reiterating the Augustinian view. The answer came following the life of Calvin, about the next generation thereafter. This was from the work of Arminius, Jacob Arminius, who compromised the semi-Pelagianism and Augustinianism and says, well, yeah, we cannot make a start towards salvation without grace. That's right. The semi-Pelagians were wrong. But and even though we have a completely fallen nature, which Arminius allowed, still, he wanted to say there is still something in us which has and here was his key word, but capacity to do good. Now, the semi-Pelagians said we could actually do good. We could actually make a start toward God. Now, Arminius saw the fault in that, so he said, but there's still an ability to, there's a capacity to do good, and thus, if grace comes, You see, even though we never do that, we never use that capacity to do good without grace. Once the grace comes, we then have the capacity to participate, to cooperate with it. That was where he really probably coined at this point that we cooperate with grace. So he served a while back. The Puritans responded. The Puritans being the authors of the Westminster in the 1640s. And they have men of this, and they've reiterated the Augustinian view. Then the answer came with Wesley, who compromised it again, he recalled. He really maintained that we're totally fallen, but that a universal effect of the crucifixion of Christ was to restore us to basically what Arminius had said, the ability that we cooperate with grace. So this should not be of a view for him. I also indicated the Roman Catholic view is right about there as well. And a great deal of Christianity in the modern age has centered, and I mean by this evangelical Christianity, has centered more or less in this particular posture. The Augustinian view has never been the majority view. It is the Reformed view. It is the heritage of the Presbyterian Church. I would say the majority of Presbyterians today don't adhere to this particular view. So in terms of, if you want to take a statistical analysis at this point, I'd say, you know, that's something you ought to bear in mind. Now, there's another movement in the church's history in the 19th century by Bertrand Schleiermacher and Ritschl and Christorian Harnack and certain others, which is typically called liberalism, which arose in the mid-1800s, early mid-1800s, flowing heavily out of the philosophies of Kant and Hegel after him. And there would be a return really back to the Pelagian understanding. Liberalism, I think, would clearly be very Pelagian, maybe not as Pelagian itself, but in at least some versions, very Pelagian. I'm leaving those out. I'm more of a centering on what we would call evangelical understandings. And all of these groups, particularly Wesley, Arminius understanding, would broadly fall inside a generic term we might call evangelical. What I said I wanted to do then was come back and review how the Reformation and really how the Westminster treated this. The way I want to do it is by looking at something you may be familiar with, but it's helpful at this point. And I don't bring it up to develop, but only to review it. And that is to look at the 5 points of Calvin. And again, a few weeks ago, and we would do that at this point, but I think it gives us maybe the most terse and simple expression of how the Reformation restated the Augustinian point of view. And really, in terms of the Westminster, there's not a lot of additional material at this point, but the Westminster clearly depends on Calvin's understanding. And particularly here, I think we have an opportunity to at least get the salient features of Calvinism. The reaction that came from Arminius, which is called the Remonstrance, set forth a 5 points of reaction. And I think the 5 points of Calvin actually were just still in that debate. I think Calvin would agree with these 5. So it's helpful. And also it's neatly built around the little acronym TULIP. Anyway, this is a helpful way of remembering it, and I hope that this will assist you. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this already, but a review won't hurt you. So the first point in the Reformation, certainly the first point, I think, as we've clearly seen it in the Westminster, is the idea of total depravity. An expression which is easily misconstrued because it tends to suggest or connote an idea that we are monsters. And we have done monstrous things in our human history. We have monstrous moments, to be sure. But at the same time, I think it's perfectly clear that even the unregenerate person is capable of doing things which are works that are of great humanitarian benefit and so on. And it would seem a little naive to actually stand for the proposition that the human race does at any given moment the worst thing it could possibly do. But total depravity was never intended to suggest that. And that's where the term is a little misleading to the side. When we think of depravity, we think of, depraved. It sounds, it has a whole different flavor to it than his original sense. And thus the more modern phrase that's sometimes used, which may be a little more descriptive at least, is the term radical corruption. Say, that the corruption of our human nature is radical. Reaching, the word radical meaning reaching to the roots of our being. We are not, at some point deep inside us, untouched. Sin has touched us body and soul, mind and spirit, all the faculties and parts thereof, to quote the Westminster. There's nothing left in us that is an undefiled. We are wholly defiled. This is really the idea here. Another expression is that we are dead. I think there's something kind of total about the word dead. You see, and that's the idea. Yeah. It's about as bad off as you can get. It's really not much more that can be done to hurt or reduce the strength of a person who is dead. That's the final statement. And so the biblical language, we were dead in trespasses in sense. Our condition of corruption is total, just as death is total, not partial. Anyone know what the U is for? Is it new to most of us? The U is for unconditional election. If you were here a few weeks ago, you recall that we indicated that predestination functions with a person's view with the fall. This is something that's often missed, and yet those two are absolutely connected to each other. That's why Pelagius disbelieved absolutely any doctrine of predestination. The semi-Pelagians had a semi perspective on it. Arminius took it a little more seriously. Wesley took it even more seriously, and finally Augustine was very, very strong on predestination. We are absolutely dependent on the grace of God. If the grace of God doesn't come to us sovereignly, under his absolute discretion, we will not be saved, because there is nothing in us. We're dead. If a person is sick, you can say to them, come on, Paul, let's have a rule to live in there, you see? And that's what Arminius money, collaborate with grace, grab that life preserver, and you can be saved. But the Augustinian view is, hey, what can a dead man do with a life preserver? We toss a person with the rope, and they may be drowning. They may have gone down once, twice. That might be if they could still reach out and grab that life preserver and be saved. God, there's 98% of it. But there's still 2% that we have to break in the task. But in Augustine's view and the Reformed view, we're not going down to third time. See, we are lifeless corpses. We are like sticks and stones at the bottom. A life preserver doesn't help us. What God does, he doesn't toss us, you see, something to grab onto. He jumps into the water. He swims to the bottom. He grabs a lifeless corpse up on the deck of the ship, and he breathes into it the breath of life. It says resurrection, not resuscitation. CPR. You see, this is something that only God can do, raising us from the dead. And do you see how it has to be that way? If we are dead, then how can we talk about we're dead, but we still make a move to the extent its conditions on our response? To that extent, it will fail. I mean, I feel like the logic at that point is indisputable. And I think part of the problem that people have with accepting a thoroughly Augustinian view is they don't like the necessity of accepting unconditional election. So we modify our view on the point of the fall in order to give us some sense in which we are still cooperating. Or if we looked at that whole issue to some extent, to some extended discussion, really, as you recall. That's the second point. Often you'll hear people say, I heard people say, and you may have too, well, I'm about a 4-point Calvinist. I don't know about if you've ever heard that expression, but that's a very popular way of accepting what is called a kind of a modified Calvinism. And usually the point where they're equivocated is right here on the issue of limited atonement. Limited atonement simply means that the propitiation of Christ, the sacrifice that was offered by Christ, is applied to the elect and to the elect only. I want to put it another way, that Jesus died for the sins of the elect. Definite atonement. That Jesus definitely died for the sins of the elect. But again, it still leaves us with a question. I think that the problem The problem is we feel that it's something like this. Well, it seems to say Jesus wasn't strong enough. Is there some deficiency? I mean, did he save as many as he could? No, he did the best sacrifice that he could and pulled in as many as he was able to, but it was limited. And the final analysis, he couldn't get everybody in. That's the way I think it's sometimes described, that it's criticized on that basis. And if that were what it was saying, it would be rightly criticized. That's not really the point. The point is that because God has chosen from the foundations of the world and unconditionally chosen those that would be saved, as we've covered earlier in this book, that in light of his understanding of what he was going to do, the work of Christ was therefore going to be applied to those who would be saved. It helps maybe to see it this way, that in a sense, anybody who was not a universalist, to some extent, to a doctrine of limited atonement. Now, the fact is, if we hold to be true that some people will not be saved, see, some people would not ultimately wind up in heaven, then isn't it true that at least with respect to those people, the atonement of Christ was not applied to them? In other words, ultimately, the work of Christ was not applied to them because, as a matter of fact, they finally wind up bearing the brunt of the wrath of God for their own sin. I'm not talking about whether it could have been applied to them. Sufficient to apply it to them, that's not the issue. It actually was yet applied to them. Was it applied to them? It would seem to me that if they are not ultimately saved, that the answer has to be in the negative. It was not ultimately applied to them. Well, if we add to that in the broader Reformed understanding of the election, that's really all that's being said, you see, is that the work of Christ is not ultimately applied to those who are not elect, and that was in God's mind from the foundation of the world.